Welcome back to my channel. These are some stories designed for sleep. Please, if you have the time, hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me out in the algorithm. Also, if you would care to, please support me on Patreon. Link in the description. Story number 1. The Uninvited Guest. Lily had always talked about her imaginary friend, Daisy. She described her as a playful little girl who wore a yellow dress and had bright, sparkling eyes. Her parents thought it was just a phase, as Lily was an only child. But over time, they began to notice strange things. One night, after Lily had gone to bed, her mother found a small, muddy footprint on the kitchen floor. It was out of place. Leading towards the pantry, she called for her husband, but he found nothing. The next night the footsteps appeared again, but this time they led straight to Lily's room. Hesitant, the mother entered Lily's room only to find her daughter talking to someone at her toy chest. "Who are you talking to?" her mother asked. Lily smiled and pointed to the corner. "Daisy's here. She says I can't tell anyone." Terrified, the mother scanned the room but saw no one. The next morning, Lily's father went into her room to check the closet. It was empty, but as he closed the door, he heard a faint giggle, soft as a whisper. Behind him he turned, but the room was still. "Lily," he called out. "Who is Daisy?" Lily turned to him with wide eyes. "She's not my friend. She says I have to stay quiet, or she'll take me away." Story number 2. The second one. Ben always had an imaginary friend. His name was Charlie, a friendly boy with shaggy brown hair who never seemed to smile. At first it didn't bother Ben's parents, but soon strange things started happening. Ben's mother would hear him talking in his room, but when she'd check, he'd be sitting quietly by himself. One evening, after putting Ben to bed, she walked past his room and heard his voice, clearer than ever. She peeked inside to find him standing by the window, his eyes glazed over, staring into the night. "Who are you talking to, Ben?" she asked softly. "Charlie says it's time for me to go," Ben whispered. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. What? I don't understand. What do you mean?" "He says he'll come back for me soon," Ben replied, smiling in a way that made her stomach turn. That night she lay awake, uneasy. Suddenly she heard the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps, padding down the hall. She opened her eyes, expecting to see Ben, but it was only a shadow, small and shifting, too small for any child. A voice whispered from the darkness, "Charlie's waiting for me." Story number 3. The Eyes Beneath the Bed. Hannah had always been close to her imaginary friend, Freddie. They played together for hours, and Hannah would often tell her parents how Freddie loved to hide in the shadows and play hide and seek. One evening, while Hannah's parents were having dinner, they heard her giggling from upstairs. They exchanged glances. It was the kind of laughter that made you smile. But when they went to check on her, the giggles turned into something more eerie, laughter that echoed in a strange, hollow way. They rushed upstairs and opened her bedroom door. Hannah was sitting at the edge of her bed, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Hannah, what's wrong?" her mother asked. Hannah didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the space between the bed. "There's something there," she whispered, pointing at the dark void. Freddie says not to look. Her parents exchanged a nervous look. They knelt beside her daughter and asked, Freddie? Where is he? Hannah reached under the bed and pulled out a small, decayed-looking doll, one that hadn't been in the room before. The doll had no face, just smooth, pale skin. A voice, deep and cold, drifted from under the bed. She's mine now. The door slammed shut and the laughter echoed, ringing the walls. The echo in the walls. Claire had always been a rational person, a successful architect in her mid-30s. She believed in what she could see and touch, and nothing else. But when her husband, Ethan, started acting strange, Claire couldn't deny the growing fear that something was wrong. Ethan had always been a charming, confident, and full of life person, but lately he had been distant, almost robotic. He'd disappear for hours, only to return covered in bruises and scratches that he simply couldn't explain. Then he started talking to someone invisible in the middle of the night. I'm just talking to him, he'd say when Claire would ask. Who? She would ask, but Ethan would only stare at her with vacant eyes. One night Claire decided to follow him after he left the house. She trailed him through the darkened streets, keeping her distance. To her horror, Ethan seemed to be walking toward an old abandoned building near the outskirts of town. Ethan, what are you doing? Claire called after him. He didn't answer. Instead, his face twisted into a grin as he stepped through the rusted door of the building. Claire hesitated, then followed him inside. Inside, the building was freezing cold and smelled of decay. She crept down the long hallway, barely able to see anything in the dim light. Suddenly, she heard a voice, a low, grating whisper. You shouldn't have followed him. A shadow appeared ahead of her, its form twisting unnaturally. Claire froze in place. Terror flooded her chest. But before she could react, she felt a sharp tug on her sleeve. She turned to see a figure standing next to her, a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes. Its presence was familiar, yet unsettling. I told you to stay away from him, the figure whispered. It was Charlie, Claire's childhood imaginary friend. Before Claire could react, Charlie gripped her hand and pulled her toward the side door. We need to leave, now. As they fled the building, Claire heard Ethan's voice echoing behind them, but it was no longer his voice. It was something else, something dark, something ancient. The building collapsed behind them in a deafening roar, trapping whatever was inside. Claire didn't look back, but she knew that if it weren't for Charlie, she wouldn't have made it out alive. Story number 5. The Man in the Mirror. James had always been skeptical of the supernatural. As a psychologist, he had spent his entire career debunking myths and helping others confront their fears. But that was before he started seeing the man in the mirror. It had started innocently enough. He'd catch glimpses of someone behind him while he brushed his teeth or adjusted his tie. At first, he convinced himself that it was just a trick of the light, a side effect of his overactive imagination. But then the man began to speak. I'm watching you, the figure would whisper, its voice low and hollow. James would turn, but no one would be there. Soon the man in the mirror wasn't just whispering. He began to follow James, moving from reflection to reflection, taunting him. James tried to ignore it, but every time he saw the man's cold, empty eyes, his heart would race. One night, after a particularly disturbing encounter in the bathroom, James locked himself in his bedroom, his breathing shallow. The man in the mirror was becoming more aggressive. Now he would speak directly to James, his voice a twisted parody of everything James feared. "You can't escape me," the man would say. James was on the verge of a breakdown, but then in the midst of his panic a familiar voice spoke to him from the shadows of the room. "James, remember me?" James turned, his breath catching in his throat. It was Nathaniel, his imaginary friend from childhood. Nathaniel had been a comforting presence when James was young, but he'd faded from his life as he got older. Now standing before him, Nathaniel was the only thing standing between James and the man in the mirror. "You need to fight him," Nathaniel said, his voice firm. "He's not real, James. He's a manifestation of your fear. You've kept him alive by being afraid." James, trembling, nodded. How? How do I stop him?" Nathaniel's eyes glowed with a soft golden light. "You stop feeding him. Face him. Look into the mirror, and don't let him control you." James walked towards the mirror, his hands shaking, but the man in the reflection sneered at him, the corners of his mouth curling into a grotesque smile. But as James stared into his own eyes, he felt a surge of strength. "I'm not afraid anymore," he whispered. The man in the mirror screamed as the glass began to crack, shattering into 1,000 pieces. With a final guttural shriek, the figure dissolved into nothingness. Nathaniel smiled and patted James on the shoulder. "You've done it. You're free." James looked around the room, but when he turned back to the spot where Nathaniel had stood, he was gone. Story number 6. The Shadows in the Basement. Sarah and Mark had just moved into their dream home, a beautiful Victorian house in a quiet rural neighbourhood. The house was everything they had hoped for, with tall windows and hardwood floors, but there was something off about the basement. At first it seemed like the typical storage space, boxes, old furniture, and forgotten memories. But when Sarah went down there to fetch some holiday decorations, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something in the dark corner of the basement felt wrong. Every time she went down, she'd hear scratching noises from the walls and faint whispers in the air. Mark dismissed it as just an old house noises, but Sarah knew better. One evening, while Mark was away on business, she decided to face the fear. Armed with only a flashlight, she descended into the basement. The air was thick. The shadows seemed to pulse around her, and the scratching grew louder. She stepped forward, but something seemed to grab at her feet. Pulling her towards a corner, her flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, she felt the unmistakable sensation of something cold and unseen wrapping around her wrists. She screamed, but no one came out. The shadows began to form shapes, figures that stretched and twisted, their features indistinct but terrifying. They whispered in a language she couldn't understand, their voices clawing at her mind. Suddenly she heard a voice, clear and comforting. "Sarah, it's okay. I've got you." It was William, her imaginary friend from childhood. She had forgotten him long ago, but now he was back. The shadows recoiled at the sound of his voice. Sarah could feel his presence beside her, warm and protective. "Stand tall," William said. "You don't belong to them." With his help, Sarah pushed through the overwhelming fear. She could feel his strength in her veins, his words like a shield around her. The shadows writhed and hissed, but they couldn't touch her. "I'm not afraid," Sarah whispered. With a final desperate shriek, the shadows vanished. The basement was silent once more. Sarah stood there, her heart racing, but she knew she would never feel alone again. William had saved her, just as he always had when she was a child. As she ascended the stairs, she felt a warmth in her chest. William was still with her, and this time he wasn't going anywhere. That's all for this evening. Sweet dreams.